Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the differences in electricity or energy costs generally, but focusing on electricity for the moment. The differences in costs between, say, somewhere like Russia, which has no green energy schemes, although they do use a lot of gas to generate electricity, which is greener than, say, straight out, brown coal-fired power stations. But nonetheless, an apartment in, say, 25 minutes train, 20 to 25 minutes train ride from downtown Moscow, a one-bedroom apartment, reasonably well appointed. You call it sort of a middle-class apartment, and two people living in there would generate somewhere between $350 and at the upper end $400 a year. That's right, 12 months in electricity costs. Now, Russia has plentiful gas supplies, vast amounts of gas, and they've got lots of coal, not particularly good quality coal. It's a little bit difficult to extract, but again, there are coal-fired power stations there as well, and they've got a mixture of other sort of lesser forms of energy. So, coal and gas are really the big generators of electricity. Now, why is it that, and given the thousands of miles of pipeline they have to lay and the quite expensive infrastructure they have to put in place to get the energy around, how can they deliver it? It's 90% cheaper. That's right, 90% cheaper than we can in the West. Now, in the West, for example, electricity in Australia is comparable in price to, say, the United Kingdom or Germany or other European places. Now, how can that be? Australia has vast reserves of gas, has vast reserves of good quality, top quality black coal that's very cheap to extract. Australia's got some of the cheapest coal extraction costs in the world, and has got enough coal in Australia. Just in Australia, there's enough coal to supply the whole world for the next 200 years. That's the size of Australia's coal reserves. So Australia has some of the cheapest energy in the world, and yet it's somehow the price of the electricity in Australia is about the same as it is in, say, England or Germany. Now, in Britain, for example, they've closed down pretty much all the coal mines. I'm not sure there's any coal-fired power stations left operating in Britain. If there isn't very many. So Britain's got no access to coal, nowhere near the access to extracting gas at anywhere near the price that can be done in Australia. So Britain has access to really no cheap sources of energy, other than keeping the coal-fired power stations going. Again, they've closed most of those down. So Britain has no access to cheap raw material in terms of like coal and gas. And yet somehow the price for electricity in Britain is similar to the price in Australia, so there is effectively a Western world, globalist-controlled world price for electricity. It's got nothing to do with access to, again, the raw materials of coal and gas and so on. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a globalist-controlled, manufactured, artificial price that's being forced upon us by the globalists and their stooges in Western governments. So now, whether or not you go to a country that has an abundance of natural resources like Australia, coal and gas, that can be cheaply extracted, or you go to a place like Germany where it's got really access to no coal, some lignite, I guess, but the cheap, the crappy brown coal, but where you've got no access to cheap sources of energy, especially when that Nord Stream pipeline got nuked. Then the price of electricity in Germany, again, is comparable to that in Australia or comparable to in Canada. Now, Canada also has access to a lot of raw material in terms of energy, gas and so on, and yet their price is comparable. So what we're looking at here is a globalist-controlled, artificially manufactured and imposed without the consent of the people, and to make the lives of people infinitely worse than they were. so the cost of living is being jacked up to the up to the gazoo, and our governments that don't represent us anymore, they represent the globalists, and the globalist interests are imposing this on people needlessly. So we can get some indication from Russia, the cost of electricity in Russia, what the cost of electricity, at least in places like Australia, where there's an abundance of energy, would be. We'd be looking at $400. Now, I remember, I'm old enough to remember the days when in Australia, this is when I was a sort of young guy first, renting and that sort of thing, that there was a minimum amount of electricity that they would levy. So say every quarter it was like $15 every 3 months, and frequently I would not consume enough electricity to meet the minimum threshold, so that the electricity bill was only $15. This was the same in winter when, say, you're using electric heating and so on. And the idea of using any heating other than electric was considered sort of, because electricity was so cheap. So $60 a year it would cost me, this is going back, 40 years or something, but it would cost me $60 a year for electricity, and that was all coal-fired back in the day. And today, that same electricity bill is $3,000 or $4,000. So these are the extra costs that have been added on. It's all due to again this international electricity price that the globalists amongst the Western countries have artificially imposed on us. Now, what we can see in the Russian price of energy is what the price would be without that globalist. The globalist imposition of a manufactured price. Now, they say, well, we're only doing this to save the planet, which is, of course, utter nonsense. There are some investment firms and so on becoming very, very rich out of this scam, and let's call it what it is. It's a scam. But why does, the evil Putin, and who's so evil, why is he not jumping on the bandwagon? He could be doing this and putting all the money in his pocket or pocket of his buddies, and the energy companies in Russia are all monopolies, so they could screw the public if they. But for some reason, they're not screwing the public. For some reason, they're supplying cheap energy to the public, and of course to the business and industry and so on. Now, the standard, the cost of living in Russia is generally, and the wages are lower, of course. But the cost of living, the idea that you can rent an apartment, nice enough apartment, nothing hugely fancy, but you can rent a quite nice apartment in good commuting distance of Moscow downtown, all that sort of thing. But somewhere between, in US dollar terms, $600 to $700 a month. Now that sort of apartment would be 3 times, or not 3 times, but actually it's more than that. It was $300 to $400 a month. I'm converting from rubles in my head here, but it would cost many times that in 2 to 3 times that in say Sydney or a big Western city. But again, this illustrates that whereas the pay is lower, the cost of living is of course very different as well. But energy is electricity is a key component of the declining standard of living in the West. Not only are rents going through the roof, but things like electricity and food and so on. And the prices of food in Russia, particularly if it's locally developed and produced, is quite modest. Whereas, again, the globalists are forcing us into all Western countries that they control through their flunky stooges in a supposed Western government. They want to have world prices for everything. All food, for example, has to be a world price. And this is mean they're forcing upon us a much reduced standard of living, and doing so without our consent or agreement, and even without our knowledge. I mean, they're trying to hide it, for goodness sakes, or claiming some higher moral ground, like we're saving the planet and so on. What a load of nonsense. You've been a Tassus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.